she, her pronouns. I'm the Seattle Policy Manager for Cascade Bike Club and Washington Bikes. And I want to welcome and thank you all for joining us at the Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit today. We're excited to have you with us for this 4-day virtual event, and we're thrilled that there are so many of you joining us from across the state. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual, and those participating are joining us from many lands. Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes are two sister statewide organizations, and we acknowledge the land our offices in the Puget Sound sit on today as a traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you are currently on, you can look in the chat, and there's a link where you can look up your place on the land. Without these communities, we would not have access to this environment, and we thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. We are also recording this session, and it's going to be available after the summit. So as you probably know by now, the summit is hosted by both Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of a safe and healthy future where bicycles bring people together, eliminate inequity, and create thriving communities. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and hosting events and rides. And Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclists' rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safer for all. Huge thank you to our sponsors for contributing to the summit and allowing us to provide registration free to all attendees. So thank you to the Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and DERO. And now an intro on the session itself. This is all about safe speeds, creating transportation systems for humans who sometimes make mistakes. We're going to be hearing from Charlotte Claybrook and Dongho Chang, both of the Washington State Department of Transportation, Vinu Namani from Seattle's Department of Transportation, and John Morrow from the city of Port Townsend. This session will explain the safe systems approach, acknowledging that humans do make mistakes and highlighting the importance of designing roads that lower speeds so that if a crash occurs, it will not result in a fatal or serious injury. Our presenters will be sharing information about new legislation that provides tools for lowering vehicle speeds and getting compliance, new traffic calming guidance in the WSDOT Design Manual, and examples of traffic calming improvements that are saving lives in local communities. So I'm going to shift it over soon to our presentation. We have an extended time for the presentation compared to our other 1-hour sessions. So we have a full 80 minutes for the panelists, and we're going to give between 25 minutes or so for the Q&A. So for everybody who's attending, as the presentation goes on, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then we will get to those at the end of the presentation and learn from our panelists. And then lastly, at the end of the session, we'll also have a Google form put in the chat that you can fill out and provide feedback on this session. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Charlotte.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today and to talk about safer speeds. It's something that's near and dear to my heart as I talk about eliminating fatal and serious injury crashes, which is a goal for WSDOT, Washington State Department of Transportation, and others in the state who are working to achieve zero fatal and serious injury crashes. We're in a new environment, and it continues to change and will continue to change as we go forward. The last legislative session brought new opportunities for tools, expanding our neighborhood safe streets law so that all local authorities in WSDOT can lower traffic speeds to 20 miles per hour without using an engineering study. Also expanding our permissions to use the traffic safety cameras, automated traffic safety cameras, extending it to the whole walk route area and not just the school speed zones. It also opens it up for using automated traffic cameras in parks and playground zones, as well as hospital zones. And so I encourage you to look up information about that and how that's expanded and how that might work for your community. Also, I can say that our agency, Washington State Department of Transportation is making positive changes. Just this month, we released a new design manual, and in that design manual, we have a updated section about traffic calming measures. Last year, the traffic manual was updated as well, and we continue to look for ways to shift our work to help lower speeds throughout the state. Now, I have to ask a quick question. Is Dong Ho with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Really?
great.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to pass it on to Dong Ho. He's going to introduce himself, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Dong Ho Chang. I'm the state traffic engineer. I've been in my new role for about a year now. And what an exciting time to be working in our profession. We are really seeing a paradigm shift in terms of trying to address some of the horrific collisions that we're seeing throughout our nation. And it's a near and dear to my heart that, that we are embarking on this effort to revise our streets so that it can be safe and accessible for all users. The safe systems approach is a approach that that others will talk about, but the two that I'm really interested in talking to you about is safe speeds and safe roads, and two things that are that have been difficult for us to change the paradigm in. And let's see. How do I? Okay, so what impacts the streets and speeds on our roads is really how our streets are designed, the laws that govern them, and sometimes the enforcement that comes with it, right? So many of you who are in communities will recognize these same type of streets all over our neighborhoods. These are streets that are designed to make sure that goods are and vehicles are moved efficiently, and they are designed in an engineering standard that performs that function. But the way that they've been performing excludes many who are outside the vehicle. And that family that's walking on that shoulder, for many of our communities, facilities are not built to accommodate for their safe use. And sometimes they're even excluded from using these facilities. Many jurisdictions will require, if there isn't a sidewalk, for a person walking to walk facing traffic. Those laws are really geared towards putting the onus on the person walking. And in this case, that family is actually violating the law, right? So they have to be walking in the other direction where a sidewalk is present on the other side. Really an absurd paradigm where we designed our facility so that it's such a huge barrier, and it even prohibits people from using it. What's really promising is that these changes are happening. And many of you may have heard of a document called Mutcd, Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's a Federal Highway Administration manual that really applies to all of our public streets open to public travel, right? So all the states have to adopt it within the 2 years after it's been published. It has to be in substantial conformance in every state. And it has a full effect of the law, force and effect of the law, right? So sometimes you'll hear from engineers and politicians and others that says, hey, this manual really limits on what we can do. We can't put in this facility because of what the manual says. And in reality, the manual is pretty flexible. So if you read through the manual, it provides that this manual describes traffic control devices, but shall not be the legal requirement for their installation. And this manual should not be considered as a substitute for engineering judgment, right? So it means that the application as a manual is really up to the individual whose responsibility is to exercise their engineering professional judgment in applying these traffic control devices. So again, it is up to all of us to make sure that we are using common sense and using our approach to make sure that we are serving the needs of our community. And so Washington State has a policy guideline called Washington State Injury Minimization Speed Management Policy. It was developed in 2020 with a group of stakeholders, including FHWA, local city officials and engineers and traffic engineers. And really it's to adopt and implement a framework that really looks at how we can minimize any kind of injuries that occur on our streets based on the context that it's located. And we're using safe systems approach to identify and prioritize how we make these investments and improvements, and then employ our thoughtful roadway design treatment so that we achieve the operating speed that we need on a particular facility. So I got a chance to visit Spokane last week, and this is a street, West Main Street, in heart of their downtown in Spokane. And to the right was what West Main Street used to look like. 4 lanes, parking on both sides, pretty wide in the heart of a business district, right? So it's really engineered to move vehicles. You can see like the amount of space that's available for pedestrians, not really that great for the environment for if you are on a bicycle. And small little intervention, if you could see what happened in the intervention, a diagonal parking was created, 1 lane in each direction on each side of the refuge island was created, and a mid-block crosswalk was marked. You can see the transformational revision just on that small little scale, right? These are things that we have ability to change everywhere in our environment, and these interventions have really positive consequences. It slows the operating speed of the driver, and it creates an environment where a person who is walking, biking, patrons of these businesses have really a conducive environment where they want to linger and frequent these businesses. And how do we avoid crashes? We do that by roadway design. We separate users in space. We separate users in time with signal phasing, and we create self-enforcing design that have the behavior that we want from all users. And the safe systems implementation is really looking at reducing that operating speed of the vehicle, so that we can reduce the kinetic energy. If there is someone who does make a mistake, it's going to be hopefully property damage, and it's not gonna result in severe injuries. And certainly, we don't want anybody to have a fatality in an interaction. One of the tools that we really look at for that is roundabouts. The design of the roundabout is really about reducing the operating speed at the location where all the conflicts occur. And so that's a great tool that has been a proven safety countermeasure that will continue to implement. One of the items that we need to do a better job of is to ensure that we are accommodating and prioritizing pedestrians and bicycles in our roundabout design and implementation. And then we also need to make sure that we are designing for that target speed, right? So we are looking for that self-explaining, self-enforcing roadway that slows the driver behavior. The very last bottom photo, you can see a raised crosswalk in Shoreline. If someone is to approach that intersection at high speed, that behavior is not going to happen the second time. It's self-enforcing design that changes behavior with this geometry. Another location that I got a chance to experience in Spokane, when I was traveling from the airport to downtown, it was week without driving last week. I was taking the bus, and what a convenient and a great service that provides. And I was able to witness a bicycle rider that was on the airport side of this connection. And I made a point that I wanted to come out and see and experience how that person experienced the facility. And there's a section that I thought, wow, this is a really good change. This is the I-90 business loop, where used to be a 4-lane with turn lanes. You can see on the left, there wasn't any space for people walking and biking. And a revision, one of the lanes were repurposed for walking and biking. You can see a 8-inch wide curb that was put in to create that additional space for people walking and biking, a crossing treatment that's put in. And by and large, the experience was by night and day difference. On this portion of the roadway, if you're on the separated facility, much more conducive for a common experience. The other side is a painted bike lane, and it's 40 miles per hour, but it feels quite a bit faster. Not as comfortable, not as convenient, and it's not a facility that I would feel comfortable using every day. So there are tools, easy to look at on where we can repurpose streets and lanes to accommodate and have that safer behavior. And of course, drainage, you can create an opening, and that's what this project did, create an opening in the curb to make sure that the water flows into that little wetland on the ditch. 12-foot wide, so you can get a sweeper in there, easily maintainable, and created a great environment with really a minimal amount of additional infrastructure. There are things that you can do with just how the intersection is implemented. This is 15th Avenue Northeast at Cowan Park in University District. 15th Avenue is a north-south arterial, went right through over Cowan Bridge. And as the bridge needed some structural loading changes, a revision was made. The intersection was actually curbed. It was created into an all-way stop. So if you look at this environment where 15th Avenue before, kind of a daunting location to cross, daunting location for people who are walking and biking. And the after, where everybody comes to a stop at the intersection, much slower speed, certainly can do more hardscape for a permanent installation, but exactly the type of changes that would be conducive to a better pedestrian bike environment, and a much more efficient for all modes where there's a lot of pedestrians. There's a park on this one side. There's a high bike ridership in this corridor, and definitely serves the multimodal all users better with the intersection reconfiguration. I also want to highlight things that we as a profession are trying to revise with the new legislation, really thinking about holistically how we're accommodating all users on our roadway. This is a SR7 down in Spanaway, where there's some number of collisions that are occurring here, and so as part of our safety review, this location came up for evaluation. And so one of the things that we looked at was the site conditions, high speed, rural condition coming into a developing area, 55 miles per hour coming into a shopping center, a moderate residential, and then housing development that's coming up in the future. Collisions that are occurring, you can see with all the colorful dots, and it's increasing over time just because the number of interactions that's occurring. And I'll show you what it looks like at that location where all the collisions are occurring. So this is actually a location that I'm very familiar with. This is where I grew up. And you can see there's no pedestrian facilities. It's a 50 miles per hour, pretty high speed, pretty daunting area. There's bus service here. and not much space if you're not in a vehicle. And even if you're in a vehicle, it's not a very comfortable space. And the location that I had to cross every day, this is a Field Road. So I crossed Field Road to get to that 7-Eleven as a kid, elementary school. We used to have a gathering and playing video games. My best friend's across the street here. So this was my daily crossing. And earlier this year, someone walking across was killed crossing the street. So, and the prior paradigm was that, we would look at maybe it's a crossing treatment, maybe it's, but really what's really important about this location is that as it develops, there's going to be more and more people who are walking and biking. There are already people there that are doing that. There's a lower income area. There's mobile home, people who cannot afford a vehicle. They're taking transit. They're walking to the grocery store. And really, it's the operating speed that's not very comfortable. And so the paradigm that we would like to and selected is a roundabout. So as you approach this entire segment, it's pretty wide. You can do a compact roundabout. You're slowing your speed at the intersection. And what's the beauty of a roundabout is that it is really efficient in terms of you're not stopping vehicles to let the other leg cross, right? So it's very efficient in terms of the carrying capacity of the intersection, but it's done in a way that's really at lower speeds. And so that interaction that does occur is, again, not very severe. And if you can see on the right, with the two-lane approach, there's a significant amount of additional pavement that's not needed anymore. You can take one lane in each direction. You can actually put it at center, median down, and have all the angle collisions that occur be eliminated. You have additional space for people walking and biking. You can do the same treatment that I saw in Spokane, put in the curbing to have a walking and biking space on both sides, right? So yeah, these type of careful treatments, you could actually reduce the operating speed. Now it's not a 50 miles per hour facility anymore. You can change it to 30. By physical design, you're engineering the behavior and the target speed that we want to create. And these roundabouts are so effective. They have a history of improvements, 82% reduction in serious and fatal injury crashes when a stop control intersection is converted to a roundabout. If you have a signalized intersection is just as effective, almost a 78% reduction. And you may say that, that's actually a 50 miles per hour, 55 miles per hour. It's a high-speed facility. How is that going to work? Well, we've tested it out in a high-speed facility. This is a Mattawa, Washington, 65 miles per hour. Not much in terms of friction. It's a rural roadway, but experiencing severe crashes where the community has to cross this roadway. And you can see on the bottom, during the peak time, the gaps are really hard to find. So there's a huge amount of queuing that does occur. And what does happen is that people get pressured and they take chances and try to find a gap that might not be appropriate. And so community embraced the roundabout as an option to test out. And from that 5-year period, 21 crashes, 22 serious injuries, and 2 fatalities. Roundabout was put in, and within the 7 year afterwards, no serious injuries or fatal crashes. So it really has proven itself in terms of safety performance. So METCD, again, it's really flexible. Ask your engineers, your municipality to work with the flexibility that's given. Pilot, this is Bell Street. It was converted to a park, Bell Street Park. You can see the change in the physical environment from a roadway that's really designed for vehicles to a space that's really conducive for people walking and biking. In this location, there was a memo that was created that pretty much established this as a park boulevard, and the features that are designed to guide traffic is being removed. You can see on the picture on the right, the initial was to have vehicles turn right. If you go there now, those vehicle signal heads are gone, and the vehicles actually cannot go through. It's a stop condition, and pedestrian and bike prioritized. Even the street name sign is brown to signify that it's a recreational space. Again, crossing, daunting location. We're never going to get the volumes that someone to cross it at this kind of condition. You have to prioritize that movement, put in the installation so that people can cross, and then make sure that you have all the implementation in place so that it is easy to utilize. And if it's not, you got to figure out why and make sure that those elements are fixed. And we have our data that shows that it is very effective. It has a huge safety improvements, and it has a broader safety improvement for all area. So this is Highway 99, Aurora, 92nd Street, school crossing location. A signal was put in for families and students to cross. We did a 3-year prior analysis. We saw 6 crashes there, and of course afterwards we saw pretty much no crashes. And in a broader area, we saw a safety benefit of 26% drop in crashes as you approach the intersection, and almost a 50% reduction in injury crashes. That's because people are slowing down. Again, the environment has changed, the operating speeds has changed, and you can do physical changes like the raised crossing to make sure that people are operating their vehicles at the appropriate speeds. And with that, I wanted to say that these tools are available. It's in our chapter 1100 design manual. They're being even tested on our state highways. This is one in Hawaii, 4-lane section, high crash corridor, and with this implementation in place, 50% reduction in injury crashes. So they are proven and they're effective. And of course, we're trying things out like on Green Lake, repurposing that space. That project is happening now, where we're taking one of the outside lanes and creating space for people walking and biking. And why are we doing that? Just making sure that we are making facilities comfortable for all users, especially people who would not even venture in those type of spaces if we do not take this action. With that, thank you. And I'll pass it off to Vanu.
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Venu Nimani. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, Vanu.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Venu Nimani. I'm the City Traffic Engineer for City of Seattle. So let me kind of like dive into my presentation and show you Seattle's approach to safer speeds on our streets. Okay, let me first start with kind of like our vision, mission, values, and goals. Seattle is a thriving, equitable community powered by dependable transportation. We are on a mission to deliver a transportation system that provides safe and affordable access to places and opportunities. Our core values and goals are equity, safety, mobility, sustainability, livability, and excellence. I deliberately started off my presentation with this because this essentially captures kind of like what our North Star is in everything that we do on our with our transportation network. So a couple of key takeaways from our presentation. I'm going to go through kind of like our Vision Zero, kind of like where we are and how we are doing and what we need to do. Give you kind of like a sense of our Streets Illustrated that guides kind of like a lot of our street redesigns, and basically dive into a little bit more into the various traffic calming efforts and interventions that we apply on our city streets. And I have some before after data for certain interventions. I can kind of like share that with you to see, kind of like show you the performance of those, and also kind of like share with you what kind of like our next steps are in the city when it comes to speed management and how it ties to Vision Zero. So why is speed important? Speed is a critical factor in the frequency and severity of crashes. Speed is foundational to Seattle's Vision Zero effort. As you can see in this graph, right, once you hit after 35 miles an hour, the severity of a crash or the kind of like the deadly outcome of a crash grows significantly, almost exponentially, once you kind of like go up on speeds. Where we are kind of like with Vision Zero, Seattle has a goal to end all traffic deaths and serious injuries by 2030. And as you can see in our graph, we have made some progress, but our trend lines are not pointing in the right direction. I don't want to hide behind, hey, this is something that we are seeing nationwide, kind of like since the pandemic, but it really kind of like this graph is kind of like a call for action to double down and do more to achieve our goal. And when we kind of like dug into our data, right, if we see kind of like who's most affected, it's people who are walking, older adults, people experiencing homelessness, and Black community members is where we see basically kind of like our vulnerable users who are walking, biking, are the ones who are kind of like most affected because of the traffic violence that we have on our street network. So let me kind of like give you a little bit of a background about safe systems approach, right? If we want to have different outcomes on our streets, then we need to have a different approach. The traditional way is thinking about preventing crashes, whereas the safe systems approach thinks about preventing deaths and serious injuries. The traditional way is to kind of like improve human behavior. A safe systems approach is to design for human mistakes and limitations so that when they do happen, the outcomes are not tragic. Traditional way of thinking is controlling for speed. A safe systems approach is reducing that system kinetic energy that transfers during kind of like an event or incident. And the traditional way of thinking is placing the responsibility on individual, whereas a safe systems approach is thinking about shared responsibility. And the traditional way of looking at things is reacting based on the crash history, whereas a safe systems approach proactively identifies and reduces risk. So here is kind of the safe systems approach that Dr. was referring to, the two quadrants kind of like where we have most influence as safe speeds and safe roads. And I want to kind of like share a quote from our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, right? He tweeted, "We never tolerate 3,000 deaths per month on American airlines or subways, but on our roads, we act like it's normal. It's time for a new mentality for roadway safety." And I can't kind of like emphasize more about why this kind of like encapsulates why we need a paradigm shift in our kind of like thinking and how we approach safety. So I'll kind of like give you two examples of our safe systems approach. Talk about leading pedestrian intervals and speed limit reductions that we have. We have kind of like done substantial work in the recent past on our streets. The first one is I want to talk about is leading pedestrian intervals. We know that about 40% of our serious and fatal pedestrian collisions occur at signalized intersections. So leading pedestrian interval is basically giving pedestrians a head start and establish themselves in the crossing so that turning traffic they're more and better visible to turning traffic at signalized intersections and thus avoid serious and fatal collisions. Over the years, we had kind of very few intersections that had leading pedestrian intervals, and now we are doing this systematically, and we have kind of like improved almost kind of like tenfold to where we are right now, the number of intersections in Seattle that have leading pedestrian intervals. Every time we go through a corridor signal retiming, we ask ourselves, where can we implement these leading pedestrian intervals and make it kind of like a default of placing them and make them part of our timing plans. There are significant benefits of these leading pedestrian intervals, 50% reduction in injuries, a 35% reduction in serious and fatal collisions. Another intervention that I want to point out is basically no turn on red. We are working on right now to apply the same safe systems systemic approach to employing more intersections that have this no turn on red restrictions that again kind of like help with the pedestrian and turning traffic conflicts that we see at intersections. So we are getting ready to kind of like package this up and kind of like get started on implementing this on a more system-wide basis, and you'll see that in the near future. So let me kind of like take a little bit of a different direction and go through kind of like what guides our design philosophy to have like to influence or have say slower speeds on our streets. We kind of like base all our design ideas on our Streets Illustrated, which is our right-of-way improvements manual. It provides our guidance on the street design and informs us on this complete streets checklist that is filled out for every single project that asks these questions about how is that project influencing influencing the design, how is that project addressing kind of like concerns of pedestrians, concerns of bicyclists, concerns of kind of like how will we accommodate in transit. So our Streets Illustrated basically kind of like establishes a typology, right, based on the place of that particular street in our network and also the function it serves. We have about 12 different street typologies, and we have certain target speeds that Danko was talking about that are assigned to these. And we kind of like these designs that we have in the Streets Illustrated consciously try to promote the target speeds that we have established for these various sections. So let me go into a little bit deeper dive into the traffic calming, right? And we have like a whole bunch of tools within our toolbox to influence speeds and lower them on our street network. And I broadly classify them and talk to them in these two groupings. One is arterials and one is non-arterials. I'm going to talk within arterials about our citywide speed limit change and the various street redesign and reallocating space strategies that we have employed on a number of projects. Talk about speed cushions, raised into crosswalks and intersections. Hardened center lines and robust center line posts are a relatively new strategy that we are piloting, and radar feedback signs, and also kind of like a new effort to understand speeds on our network. And similarly, kind of on non-arterials, there was kind of like a list of tools that we have in our toolbox that we employ as we go through kind of like their street redesigns. So let me first start with the citywide speed limit change. We did complete our employ kind of like a citywide speed limit. Most arterials within Seattle are now posted for a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. Here is kind of like a comparison of the lane miles that had the speed limit before and after the change. As you can see, kind of like beginning 2021, we have almost 90% of our arterial speed limits were reduced to 25 miles an hour. And doing this citywide allowed us to influence the projects both in planning and design and work on the next phase of the speed management. So how did this speed limit change affect? We did some before-after studies, and just kind of without any educational or outreach activities, just changing the speed limit and consistently posting the speed limit, I believe at quarter-mile intervals on the arterial segments, we saw the 85th percentile speeds kind of like moderately change, but we have seen kind of like an higher reductions in the top end speeding, people who are going more than 10 miles over the speed limit since kind of like we put this change. We did this citywide speed limit change. Again, kind of like from a crash performance perspective, right? The total number of crashes on average, right? Before on the 3 segments or the 4 segments that we have seen, right? And 1 year later, we can have seen a substantial reduction in the total number of crashes on these exact same segments where we lowered the speeds. On the right, you can see kind of like why speed matters, right? As you increase your speed, your field of vision becomes narrower and you start focusing on fewer and fewer things. And when you have like a complex street with a lot of complex interactions between pedestrians, bicyclists, transit vehicles, and the adjacent land use activity, that increase in speed was kind of like really challenging to focus on everything that's happening, and sometimes kind of like could lead to some pretty bad outcomes. Again, Danko showed several examples of reallocating space. This is, I believe, kind of like the most significant strategy on our arterials to influence the design and change the behavior and lower speeds. The example that I would kind of like point to is on Rainier Avenue. And we did kind of like a phase one of this project in Columbia City and Hillman City. And we took a 4-lane road and implemented a road diet and completely reconfigured the street, as you can see in the before and after pictures, right? Our injury collisions were down by 30%. Collisions with people walking and biking were down by 40%, and top end speeding was down by 75%, substantial improvements. Again, most recently, we are continuing several phases of this work, and just kind of like in 2022, we have prioritized transit on this corridor. Again, reallocating the space that we have on the street and prioritizing and giving space to the transit and reducing kind of like that footprint where, or the impression of drivers that it's a wide open roadway and they can kind of like take higher speeds. This particular kind of like transit improvement or street reallocation design also helps with the Route 7 transit line. It's one of the highest ridership in the state and a lifeline for a Rainier Valley community. It enhances their transit speed and reliability, especially during congested peak hours, and make progress towards city's climate and equity goals. Another example that I'd like to point out is Northeast 65th Street. And this is kind of like another street reallocation project that we have done between Northeast Ravenna Boulevard and 39th Ave Northeast. And again, kind of like here, the way we approach the street reconfiguration is to reallocate the space to put protected bike lanes. We lowered the speed limit to 25 miles an hour, install pedestrian countdown signals at several intersections, upgraded signal facing to include protected left turn faces, right? And installed a hardened center line on Roosevelt Way and repainted a lot of crosswalks. Ever since we did that, you can see kind of like both in the west and the east segment, there was a substantial reduction in the average annual crashes reported on that particular segment, and pretty much kind of like no left turn collisions in 2019, and a 67% reduction in pedestrian collisions on the same corridor. Just to kind of give you visually how the street segment changed. The one on the right is the east segment, and the one on the left is the west segment. As you can see in the before condition, it's a wide open lane with just a center line marking. And in the after condition, you can see kind of like the protected bike lanes that reallocate and basically narrow the field of vision, kind of like of the space that the motorists could use, and implement kind of like more friction so that motorists are not tempted to drive as quickly as possible through this section. And we did something kind of like unique on this particular corridor, is to incorporate kind of like the bicycle design and the pedestrian and the bus loading activity through a combined zone, so that we could use the existing face-to-face of curb to face of curb space to not only serve bicyclists, but also to serve our transit riders and transit ridership. So this is how kind of like it looks like after construction, and it's a shade stop that you can see kind of like at several locations on Northeast 65th Street, and it's kind of like been a success when we have gone back and studied this and looked at kind of like what the interaction between bicyclists and passengers, either boarding or alighting at these bus stops. We have some continuing reservations internally, but overall it has been a really good really good intervention that changed and reconfigured the street, and kind of like even we haven't heard anything kind of like negative from our metro partners, and that's kind of like really count that as a success. Another thing that we use on our arterials is speed cushions. Speed cushions are basically kind of like speed humps, but with slots in between them to allow for and accommodate the wheelbase of emergency vehicles, so that we impact all the motorists and the general purpose traffic on the street, but still kind of like give emergency vehicles the opportunity to go through while maintaining their speed. What we have seen typically is a reduction of up to 5 miles an hour on the average speeds, but really kind of like where this becomes effective is again kind of like significant reductions on the high-end speeding. Again, kind of like some considerations to go with is to make sure that we put these where we have good lighting, and there's kind of like looking at the pavement conditions and the edge of roadway are some considerations. This is an example of a picture from Highland Park neighborhood where we did a home zone project and installed speed cushions. Radar feedback signs is kind of like another strategy that we use to influence motorist behavior on arterials. These are kind of like dynamic. They basically capture the speed of the approaching vehicle and provide certain information feedback loop back to the driver and influence their speed behavior. I don't have good kind of like before after data, but we have kind of like used this on a number of locations on our arterials, and sometimes these can be solar powered or sometimes this can be hardwired. Oh, I'm sorry, I do have data on this. So again, kind of like looking at the before after impacts of the 85th percentile speed, you can see kind of like the percentage change, especially kind of like this last column, where people kind of like the high-end speeders, people who are going over 40 miles an hour, is where we are seeing that substantial reduction in speeds. Raised crosswalks. Here is kind of like an example of a raised crosswalk at Ballard Multimodal that we implemented as part of Ballard Multimodal project. It basically shifts the paradigm of pedestrians being in the space of motorists as they are turning, to motorists being in the space of pedestrians as they make their turning movements, and slow down vehicles that are entering valid locks and prioritize walking and biking. Here is an example of a raised crosswalk of Burgelman crossing at Blakely Street. This is the previous example was a side street raised crosswalk, and this particular example is for a Burgelman trail crossing an arterial. And again, kind of like it changes the whole paradigm of this crossing of who's in whose space as they're negotiating this, and influence lower speeds. We are kind of like exploring raised crosswalks in more locations across more arterials to reap similar benefits of implementing them. Another recent tool that we are testing is hardened center lines. These are basically kind of like plastic strips that form extensions of the center line at the intersections, so that turning vehicle, rather than taking the most expeditious path or the fastest path of turning through an intersection, will have to make a more slower and circuitous path around when turning, and thus kind of like basically slow down as it's turning and look for pedestrians who are crossing at the intersection. We are testing this at several locations, and our testing still continues. I know that several other jurisdictions like Washington, D.C. and New York have used them more consistently across their intersections, and we want to see kind of like what their performance is on city streets here in Seattle, and explore this innovative measure going forward. Robust centerline posts. Again, this is Aurora app Ship Canal. We have installed these posts in 2021 to again kind of like change the perspective of motorists who are negotiating this section and slow down their speeds. And these posts are really tested for high speed and high performance, that each one of them can take like up to 200 hits at 70 miles an hour. And that is kind of like the data that we got from the vendor, and our experience was very similar, that these posts kind of like still stand up after a year after evaluation. Another thing that we are that I want to share is basically kind of like data, right? So we do kind of like collect speeds at certain locations and throughout the city during our normal course of action. But what we have done this year is basically went out and bought a third-party data from a company called Iteris. The product is called Iteris Clear Guide. What this uses is, it uses the probes inside connected vehicles and anonymizes their data, their trip data, to give us information on information of speeds on our city streets. So kind of like this has been tremendously useful and in the department, and everybody is using this tool to understand what the speeds are on various segments where we have not had a chance to go out and collect data, and understand where kind of like our high speed segments are, and try to kind of like formulate interventions to deal with those segments more proactively. Again, I want to shift slightly from the arterials to non-arterials, right? And we have kind of like a whole bunch of tools. Art and right-of-way is something that we encourage community to establish that identity through street murals on non-arterial streets. These are some low-cost options that basically create a sense of space and sense of for the neighborhood, and influences how motorists see the streets or use the streets in our neighborhoods. Walkways is another intervention that we use again to reconfigure our street space to provide those walking and biking opportunities to let kind of like folks use the street and reduce the cross section that's available for motorists to speed through the neighborhoods or kind of like travel at faster speeds. Curb outs and curb extensions are another tool that we use on our on a variety of intersections, both arterial, non-arterial intersections, to slow down turning traffic as they are making their turns, and also to minimize the crossing distance that pedestrians need to cross or bicyclists need to cross, and reduce their exposure and influence kind of like the safety outcomes at those intersections. Partial street closures is kind of like another tool that we use to prohibit traffic from entering, basically shifting the function of the street from to kind of like provide more access and give kind of like prioritize people walking and biking in both directions. And traffic circles has been another tool. We have over 1,200 traffic circles on our in our neighborhoods that change kind of like how motorists view those streets, and rather than going straight through, they kind of like cut down the speeds on the residential streets. Chicanes kind of like is another example of taking out that straight line paths and making people take a more indirect path as they're negotiating and influencing their speeds. Diagonal diverter is kind of like another example of taking traffic off of the streets and trying to minimize or not provide kind of like direct routes that would encourage both traffic volumes and speeds through our neighborhoods. I purposefully kind of like focused more on engineering measures within with what we are doing on our street network, and kind of like restrict myself from talking too much about enforcement, because I believe that to promote kind of like a safer street, we have a lot more responsibility to do from a street redesign perspective. But we do have automated enforcement, both kind of like in school zones that we effectively use, and red light cameras, and we are piloting automated enforcement for block the box and transit lanes. But what we are also trying to do is to understand automated enforcement, which is a punitive measure from a transportation equity, and we are undergoing kind of like a racial equity analysis on who does automated enforcement impact the most. And as you can see, kind of like here, the where we have the automated enforcement across the city, and some of kind of like the locations where we have disadvantaged population in the city. So we're trying to understand that interrelationship a little bit more as we as we learn more about this particular enforcement technique. And education, I again kind of like I lean less towards this, but we do have some campaigns, a joint public safety campaign with Portland Bureau of Transportation to communicate that message that slower speeds is what we want to promote, and we do that through our Safe Routes to School program to educate kids and kind of like catch them and set kind of like early behavior, good behavior patterns. Next steps, where do we go from here? We are right now working on a revised Vision Zero action plan that really prioritizes speed reduction systematically. We know where our interventions work and what those are, but how can we scale those up and implement them on a larger scale across the city is something that we will be focusing on going forward, and also to explore some innovative treatments on influencing speeds. So with that, I will pause there and I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Venu. Let me just pop my screens up here. Hi, everybody. My name is John Morrow, and I'm the city manager in the city of Port Townsend, and about as far west as you can go. And I am, let me just get sorted here. It's a real treat to be here. It'd be great if we were in person, but my hat's off to, to some degree, the hierarchy of colleagues at agencies, both larger cities and Venu's work, as well as Dong Ho's work at WSDOT. And in fact, a lot of you folks who are in the audience, I know your names, and I'm really grateful you're here. I think the things that we enjoy in the streetscape are really owed to the folks before me who gave the presentations. In fact, I've ridden and walked many of the things that on a daily basis when I lived in Seattle that Venu was just speaking about. So I'm going to take it down to the very small scale level of a small town of just about 10,000 people. I'm going to do, let me just see here. I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of context about this place, because everyone likes to think that they're special, but I think we're very unusual, a small town. And then I'll just go through a few examples, and actually some of them take what Dong Ho and Venu were talking about at a larger scale and bring it down to the local, sort of village scale to talk about implementation. And then I think I'll do a quick summary, and I want to leave some time for questions and answers too. I feel compelled to do this because I've actually worked for the city of Seattle and Cascade Bike Club in my history. And so I'm very much a bike person. I don't hide that in my role as the chief executive of this small town, but I've kind of oscillated between these things. So I feel compelled to just say, if I feel like you are my people, and I'm really grateful for the attention on this. And I really take this as part of my seriousness in my role to continue to make Port Townsend a very safe, accessible place for all modes. So our town, well, we're historic. We were going to be Seattle or San Francisco until the railroad stopped. We're artistic. If you come to visit one of our festivals or artist experiences, you know that. And we're connected. And that's just a little snippet of our walking and bicycling guide map. You'll also note from this, this is just kind of the outline of the city, just for some aerial context here. We've got quite the non-motorized network, a lot of streets, and for a small town of just barely 10,000 people, there's a lot to take care of. And so I just want to iterate that there's some real challenges as a small community with quite a vast amount of infrastructure for one that does not have a large tax base. And I've dropped down the crash data, at least from 07 to 17 there. So I can show that at least my team is really thinking through how to attack some of this problem with that data. The other background, I think, as I just kind of alluded to, mean, 81 miles of streets and roads is our responsibility. There's almost 100 miles of total roads, quite a lot of parks. And so in a way, I don't want to say this comes easy to us, but a lot of our streets and our trails look like this. And these aren't the glamour shots that I could show, but they're the fierce reality of a large network and our inability to really bring them up to full level of service standard. And to some degree, and I really appreciate that, because some of my bosses, my elected city council, often advocate for keeping our streets and our side streets in relatively poor condition, because they are a very effective traffic calming measure. We also have quite a long history of encouraging traffic calming, and it's one of the things we get most from our residents. I'll dive into a couple of these examples in a second, but just to give you a visual of, our main street into town, which is technically Highway 20, it's a state road, into Water Street, how we work to constrict the lane there and actually get bikeways and delivery space there was quite innovative. F Street, which I ride at least a couple times a day on my bike ride to work, and the speed humps and medians there, I can't take credit for that. That was done long before my very few couple years here, but it was an exemplar project. And then Sheridan Street, just even taking the things to a median to allow for crossing, safe crossing, and those bike lanes there on Sheridan Street. The other thing is we continue to invest, and I don't want to get too stuck into this map, but again, we're taking like one step at a time, allocating very small amounts of funding at drawing connections into our road, street, and trail network. And this is just an example of what we're taking into our budget this year to propose to City Council as part of that process. All right, so second part, just 4 examples. Edge lane roads. This actually on Blaine Street, just from the aerial here, is a temporary project that we took on just this year. And, it was a bit of an experiment. We went out and we painted it, and, we talked to the community a bit, and we got quite a lot of feedback. Edge lane roads are pretty proven to, at least in larger studies, I think it's like 44% reduction in crashes. People go slower. It creates some uncertainty there. If you're head to head with a car, it provides space for people walking and people biking. And it also really helps us in the maintenance costs. It's just, I don't want to say we should let all our streets, kind of go feral, but to some degree, we don't have a choice in a large network. We need $50 million to actually bring all streets up to snuff. That's much larger than our total annual budget as a city. So, it's a creative approach to get a multiple set of outcomes. You've got, safer, reduced costs to maintain. You can kind of delay the need for replacement, and better outcomes in terms of crash data. This is kind of what it looks like. Interestingly, it's being striped permanently today. So I can say that it looks good when I went out and looked at it. We'll continue to roll out edge lane roads across the city as we go. The other example I wanted to share was compact roundabouts or roundabouts. And Dong Ho talked about this eloquently earlier. And I will say too, with a lot of appreciation for WSDOT, we've worked through this project with WSDOT to some degree of success. It's not built, it's just beginning to kind of get onto the drawing board. But we have an intersection that would be normally a signal replacement. We'd put streetlights up and or put them, kind of keep them there. But our residents and city public works team, transportation team thought we could probably get a different set of outcomes here if we took a more creative approach, and top marks for WSDOT to being open to that conversation and really helping to drive it. Won't go through every detail here, but this is kind of what it looks like now. I mean, the pavement's in poor condition. We've got issues like, stormwater to deal with, but some of the interventions include, rain garden and buffered bike lanes, and kind of reclaiming some of that current roadway space into park and other uses. This is just concept, but you can see that, we're sketching out ways to really add some value to the roundabout. I think there's a perception in town that from people who ride and bike and walk, that it is potentially more dangerous. And so we're trying to do some education. We went out with our disability awareness group and blindfolded ourselves and walked across for that experience. And I'm really, I've got high aspirations for this project when it happens. And then I think this is my final slide on that one. On that corridor, this is what it looks like, and kind of the width of the lanes, and you know, essentially what we're proposing to do, you know, in that space. And then, of course, you know, if you look at, you know, Streets Blog or anywhere else, you know, think round. So I just wanted to make that point that, you know, safety for vulnerable road users is one of the great reasons why roundabouts can work. Check out the URL there on the bottom of the slide. The third thing I wanted to share too is, again, kind of gritty for a small town with limited funds to work with a community to crowdsource a pilot project. You know, we heard we need to control speed, and we said, great. And actually, people passed the hat for that. A little bit of sweat equity, much like projects I've been involved in Seattle, but you know, some pilot testing of what you know, really bringing a little bit of Seattle to Port Townsend looks like in terms of those traffic circles. So this is the experiment before we went full bore. We tested them. These aren't our examples, but you know, temporary cones and markings, and really thought, okay, you know, we want to achieve these results, but know if it works before we invest neighborhood dollars. The community actually came up with $10,000, and then we were going to match that with staff time. We need to determine if you know, there's unintended impacts on other streets, just to make sure it still serves the purpose, because it's actually a higher volume street, and get a sense of the feedback. So we tested it. We, like I said, put them in the trial basis for about 2 months. This is a couple years ago almost, and it went looking like this to this for a test. You can see we did some signage, and then you know, started claiming some of the space on the shoulders as well. And ultimately, this is the design that is now permanently installed on Washington Street. Of course, show me the data. Got a chance to talk about that with Mike Bloomberg at one point, and love, that's his phrase, I think. But you know, the data show that it, you know, kind of works. So you know, even a 3% drop in the 85 percentile speed is kind of a big deal for us. You might be marveling at the low numbers there across the board for streets in Port Townsend. We tend to drive and walk and bike relatively slow, but that to me signals it works, and so we went ahead with the investment. And then the last one I wanted to share is just kind of the obvious no-brainer. And when I worked for Cascade, I used to say this as an advocate quite a lot. You know, you really need to connect the network and really, you know, continue to make strategic investments to unify the network, to not put in random pieces around, but to actually make it work synchronously together. This is right near our elementary school, and there's sort of a cycle track to, I don't want to say to nowhere, but it does end after where the elementary school is. And what we want to do, if you can look at, focus your eyes on the kind of turquoise blue, where it says Salish Coast Elementary, and that arrow that says existing cycle track, that's what I was just showing in the slide. And there's about a half a mile along that corridor of a Discovery Road that goes to a roundabout where, frankly, there's quite a lot of development planned, and we anticipate a lot of school trips to be made. And so again, top marks to WSDOT for their and TIB for you know, providing some funding. We also received some federal funding, and in a small town like ours, you know, if you could receive $5.5 million of funding, it really makes a project go a long way. So we're going to rebuild, you know, that roadway. We're going to put a two-way cycle track on the south side. You know, a pedestrian sidewalk on the other side, which it does not have one. And that's roughly what it will look like. Let's see, yeah. And then, of course, I guess some raised crossing examples from other streets that we'll use as part of the design features on Discovery Road to do some traffic calming. So look, I can talk a lot about this further, but we do want to leave some time for Q&A. So I think I've done that, and back over to you. Thank you.
Hey, great timing. So it's just encouraging people to continue filtering their questions in. Have a couple on our collective sheet that I'll start with, and as more come in, I'll see how many we can get through. First, I just want to acknowledge someone had asked a question about changes to Washington driver's education curriculum, and it looks like Dong Ho already answered that, so I can circle back to that just to make sure everybody got it if we've got time at the end. But also, if you're curious about that, I think it was Dong Ho, there's already an answer somewhere back in the chat, which you have to kind of scroll a little bit to get to. But I think I'm there's quite a few questions for Vinu in Seattle, but I'm going to try to see if we can make them broad to cover more than just a large city like Seattle. But first, I'll start with a specific one because this one seems fitting. Vinu, has there been a change recently in Seattle in the profile of speed cushions in terms of, are they higher or steeper or in some way becoming more effective, I guess, at making sure the drivers really have to slow down over them?
So the height that we try to kind of like achieve with our speed cushions is 3.5 inches, and they have a 1/2 inch tolerance on either side. I don't know, kind of, we haven't changed that recently, but there is some construction tolerances there between that we try to kind of like aim for when we're trying to deal with such small dimensions.
Okay. And this is a good question for both Vinu and John, and Dongho, you can chime in too, but I'll start with John because I'm curious I'm curious for all three of you what your thoughts and local approaches are to automated enforcement as a method of changing dangerous driving behaviors. Someone called out, particularly in Seattle, in the Rainier Valley, that's a community where there's higher proportions of communities of color and how that affects it. So I know that's a topic that comes up in Seattle, but I'd like to start with John first, just because I'm curious if that is also being talked about in Port Townsend.
Currently, no, is the easier answer. But let me just clarify the question. So automated enforcement was in Port Townsend. Is that what the question was, Rachel? Yeah.
Is it something that's being talked about, considered? Why or why not?
It might be now that we're having this conversation here. I think roughly, I mean, you look at what we can do on a shoestring, and I think part of it, not as an excuse, but we struggle with the resources to do things in a comprehensive way. And in fact, one of the things we're trying to do, here's a little bit of the dodge, is to really establish a specific funding source that allows us to make transportation investments. Because you can see, if we're passing the hat in our community to do, traffic circles, it's pretty dire. I think doing so will give us, and we're doing that kind of in a kind of two-step process with our budget this year. It'll give us a chance to think about some of those systemic improvements that'll make it safer for everybody.
Great. And then I'll pass it up to Vinu, who can talk about what it's like in Seattle.
Yeah. So we have a lot of experience with automated enforcement, both as speed cameras within school zones to red light cameras and the automated enforcement that we are piloting for transit lanes and block the box, right? So with the kind of like limited resources that we have towards traffic enforcement, automated enforcement gives us that additional ability to monitor kind of our system. And even FHW recognizes automated speed enforcement as an effective tool for influencing speeds, right? But in Seattle, where we are having the conversation, is trying to understand who are we impacting the most, right? And how is this impact communities of color, right? For affluent people, kind of like paying that automated speed enforcement ticket might not be as much of a hit, but it is substantially kind of like impacts financially disadvantaged. So we want to kind of like, as part of our transportation equity framework, we are doing a deep dive into who's getting these and how's this kind of like impacting various communities. And I think we're still kind of in the stage of understanding those impacts. And we want to focus more on changing our street design in such a way that we don't have to enforce. We want to build streets that are self-enforcing. And we see kind of like automated enforcement or other kinds of enforcement as a temporary fix to a problem that reflects on the inherent design of the system.
Great. That's great context for all the different ways that tool can be used and whether it should be used at all. Dongho, I know you've been doing this for a while and have seen different communities try all sorts of traffic calming methods. So I'm going to lob this one at you first. Have you experienced any jurisdiction installing RRFBs, which I want to define that, and I always forget, it's rectangular rapid flashing beacons, I believe, Have you ever experienced a jurisdiction installing those with the result that the motorists didn't slow down or stop for bike peds? In other words, did someone go through the process of installing this, find out it didn't work, and then if so, what comes next?
Yeah, so it really depends on the context where it's utilized. And so FHWA has a pretty good guideline for when reticular active flashing beacons are utilized versus just an active flashing beacon, right? So the sign and the marking is the primary control, and then the active flasher just gives the warning that someone is there. It's supposed to stop anyway. So really the law is that when the pedestrian's at the location, regardless of the conditions, you should be stopping. It's a level up from just the signing and marking. So it just adds a level of awareness. And what we find is that higher volume and in locations that have more than 2 lanes in each direction, right? So those tend to be harder for pedestrians to find a driver stopping. And in many instances, when that does occur, and we are, I think we need to really be thoughtful about how do you put the right device in there, treatment for the crossing, so that whoever's utilizing that crossing gets the benefit of the most effective traffic control. And what we're finding is that in those locations that we're not getting compliance, we escalate and put in a regular traffic signal so that people understand what a traffic signal is. Really high compliance rate. And other things that you can do as in terms of countermeasure, you can put in, additional deflection. So you can actually raise the crossing. Every time someone goes over, it's like, it's a reminder there's a crosswalk here, right? So, or you can even narrow the lanes, right? So that if you don't need the additional capacity, that has a huge impact. Because what it does is that if you have multiple lanes like that, first driver might stop, someone behind them might realize, hey, why is that guy stopping? And they pass on the left or the right, and the person who's crossing has no clue that this driver is coming. And so really have to be thoughtful about the type of situation we employ it, and then make sure that if there is a stop bar is far enough so that if someone is passing, they can still see the person crossing.
And Rachel,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, John.
I was going to take a playful and humorous approach to an answer on automated and even some of the other interventions and say, kind of the context like Dong Ho said, we're technically a city, but we're a really rural location. And so our automated traffic control is really our deer population, which is substantial. And people know that. And there's no equity issues there. I mean, everybody can get a deer, and I've almost done that many times on a bicycle. So to some degree, we have a little bit of natural help here.
And I wanted to maybe provide some context as well on the automated enforcement. Again, I think I 100% agree with Manu. Our engineering, we need to design our streets so that we get the behavior that we want. There are instances where, just the way that the roadway functions, there'll be periods of low utilization and high opportunity for someone to speed. And so in those instances, I think automated enforcement could be an interim solution. But again, we want to make sure that we have the right context. We don't want to utilize them in a way that's going to have that unintended consequence of financially hurting someone who can't afford it. But we also know that automated enforcement works. So when someone gets a ticket, they don't get another ticket. It's almost a 95%. First ticket, you don't get a second ticket. So it's very effective in changing behavior. And so in those instances where it's really critical, it's a useful tool to make sure that people who are utilizing that space get the benefit of that lower operating speed.
Right. So what I'm hearing is it's like a spectrum of tools and mechanisms that traffic engineers have at hand, and it's about applying the right ones. So they're trying to apply the right ones to the right situations. Thank you, John, a lot for that. It's just always good to I'm in Seattle myself, so it's always a good reminder of just how different traffic engineering and our situations can be between a city like Seattle and a city like Port Townsend. Would have never thought of deer as a
it's
natural.
for real. You should come visit and check it out. It's for real.
I'm going to switch gears quickly to talking about sidewalks. This is originally a question for Vinu, and that's how does the city of Seattle require sidewalk construction for all new builds? Can you talk about how that kind of helps or hurts the lack of sidewalks that we may still have?
So in Seattle, kind of like we have a huge need for sidewalks. Whenever there's a new development that comes in, either kind of like putting in a new building or redeveloping an existing site, it's our streets illustrated that guides the design cross section that's adjacent to that particular site. And almost kind of like all kind of like street designs, kind of like in the typologies that we have, kind of like advocate for sidewalks. So yes, we go through when the applicant comes in and require them to kind of like look at not just the sidewalk, but the entire frontage of that particular property and promoting the appropriate pedestrian environment, right? But even with that, we have a significant need for new sidewalk in communities, in communities where we don't have a project or where there's no redevelopment that's happening. And that's where kind of we are employing tools like low-cost walkways, where we are redesignating the neighborhood streets and reallocating the space on these neighborhood streets to create those walkways and that walking space as a temporary solution until we can come back and put in more permanent features like sidewalks.
And John,
Rachel, can I chime in a little bit?
Yeah.
So I think our policies for sidewalk is broken. I think it's we really have to change that paradigm. We would not have the sidewalk policy in the same way that we have for vehicles. So it just does not create a continuous. Walking is a fundamental thing, right? So as a basic mode, we depend on property owners to build and maintain and have this continuous sidewalk system. It's kind of absurd in my opinion. I think we need to change our policy so that we create a, just like the travel lanes, have that as a function of government, that we need to provide the space for people who are walking and rolling as their primary mode, and that we need to take that burden off from the homeowners to maintain that space. I think it's just a kind of an absurd way to operate a transportation system, and it's something that we all need to raise to our elected officials, and make sure that it is something that gets talked about, and hopefully we can change.
We look forward to the WSDOT pass-through funding to make that happen.
And actually, you know, with the move ahead of Washington, we have complete streets, and it is part of our mandate now, which is amazing.
Well said.
Did you have anything else to add to that, John, in terms of what?
No, I plus one that, and I just say, you know, I concur, because, you know, where we need to be designing for all modes, and we do have a complete streets policy here at Port Townsend, and we do struggle with, you know, there's a sidewalk being built across my home, and, you know, I mean, the homeowner does bear the burden, the cost, particularly of new development. And especially with housing crises all around places like Puget Sound, you know, somebody's got to, you know, some pressure's got to give. So I like what it says about what we prioritize in the streets, that we prioritize safety in all modes. You know, and despite the fact you can walk down most roads in Port Townsend safely right down a center line, because there is no line and cars are going about 12 miles an hour, it's still absolutely deficient here, and we need to make some progress.
Great. I have, I think, a bit of a technical question now, also about Seattle. Vinu, someone is asking, what is Seattle's policy on APS and LPI? Do you require signals to have APS before implementing LPI? And before you
want to
answer
explain
that
what
question,
APS and LPI
I was going to say,
is.
before you answer that question, can you please spell out the acronyms? And
yeah, absolutely. APS stands for Accessible Pedestrian Signals. Basically, they are a system of kind of like curb ramps and push buttons that help visually challenged pedestrians orient themselves towards a crossing at a signalized intersection and help cross, right? The push button is kind of like sometimes kind of it has the arrow that's sensitive to the touch, and that's how kind of like they orient themselves, and and it's accompanied with an audible beep so that they can know and listen to both the tactile portion of it and the audible portion of it to orient themselves and cross at a location. LPI stands for Leading Pedestrian Role, as I was saying that in my presentation. It's basically a timing feature within the traffic signal controller. It lets pedestrians get out into the crossing and start crossing for, gives them like a 5 to 7 second heads up, right? Before it lets the conflicting traffic movements go at the intersection. What this does is it lets the pedestrians get into the crossing and establish themselves and be more visible before the conflicting turning vehicles come across the same crossing. So these kind of like are two different features at signalized intersection. I don't think they are. I don't think one needs to be in place for the other to be there. LPI is a controller, a change in the signal controller, and how it sequences various movements at the intersection, whereas the APS is actual physical infrastructure that helps visually challenged pedestrians orient themselves and learn kind of like when they can start to cross through both tactile and audible cues. I don't think one needs to be there, but what we are doing, kind of, we are doing the automated enforcement pilot for block the box and transit lane enforcement. And the legislation explicitly says that after we pay for all the administrative costs, 50% of the revenues that are collected would go to the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, and the other 50% will be utilized by the city to implement as many audible, accessible pedestrian signals as possible. I believe we are kind of like targeting 50 intersections this year based on what we see kind of like as the revenue outlay. We are trying to do more and more APS signals, especially whenever we touch a signal and we do substantial changes to a signalized intersection. We are incorporating accessible pedestrian signals as a default in the signal redesign.
Okay, great. And I think we'll have time for one quick question. I'm going to toss it to Dong Ho, which is, which design manual or guidance would you recommend is best to look at for finding the criteria to change an arterial from 4 lanes to 2 lanes, like with a center turn lane, including bike lanes, whichever? Where would you point that person?
So the FHWA has some good guides on road diet. So that's what it's called, the road reconfiguration. And it originally came from a flow chart the Seattle developed, and so Seattle also has a guideline as well. But it provides some really good context on what the volumes are, lane configuration, ADT, and then also when you should consider peak hour analysis. One caution is that, again, traffic is not it's very dynamic, right? So one thing that you really have to think about is what's the broader long-term goal for the community, and you want to make sure that whatever you do on the roadway, you're really gearing towards that, achieving that goal. And so many cities, communities, they're looking for that multimodal, sustainable transport. And so sometimes those guides, if you utilize them, you actually get the wrong answers. Like, oh, we can't do it because the volumes are such. You really have to think about how do we make sure that you get the most efficient mode accommodated first, which is, it might be transit, it might be pedestrian bikes. Those trips actually reduce the number of people that need to drive, and so it actually enhances and reduces the vehicle demand. So I have to really think about that context as well.
Gotcha. And I'm sorry to cut this short, but we are at time, so I want to respect the fact that we are at 5 o'clock. Sorry, John, I just saw you put your hand up too, but I want to thank all of you for speaking with us today and answering questions. And if you don't mind, if you could put your contact info in the chat right now for those who are still on the call, then they can follow up with you on any of the specific questions if you're open to that. And Tamar put in the chat earlier, our next session is tomorrow morning at 8:30. I believe it's called People Before Polar Bears, and it's all about communication strategies and using the best communication strategies possible for advocacy. It'll be really good. And last thing before we go is Tamar also put in the chat the feedback form for today's session, so please fill that out when you have a chance. And thank you again for everybody joining us. You all have a
Thank
good rest of
you.
your evening.
Thank you all.